If you are hearing this, then I am already gone. This is Admiral Kalzorai of the 7th Constellation Fleet. We never should have provoked the Deathworlders, not like this. We thought we were the peak of civilization, but what we woke up was something ancient, something savage, something terrifyingly human. There was a time not long ago when we believed the galaxy had been tamed. War was a footnote in our history. The coalition of sapient worlds, 432 member species united across two spiral arms, had not seen open conflict in over a millennium. Disputes were resolved with words. Empires had become federations. Even our military was. Ceremonial designed for shows of force, not acts of violence. Crime, poverty, and suffering were considered historical curiosities, taught in museums, but never experienced firsthand. We had transcended brutality. We had evolved beyond it, or so we believed. And then we found them. At the outer rim of the Perseus Veil, our long-range probes intercepted irregular electromagnetic patterns, chaotic, pulsing signals emanating from a minor, uncharted solar system. The origin was a blue-green world that rotated on a tilted axis and orbited a yellow star. At first glance, it appeared insignificant. Its atmosphere was volatile, its tectonic plates unstable, and its biosphere teeming with microbial and megafaunal hazards. We called it Terra, but the creatures who lived there called themselves humans. They were primitive by coalition standards, a species still reliant on chemical propulsion, fragmented politically, socially, and even culturally. Their planetary networks were filled with conflicting ideologies, aggressive propaganda, and violent entertainment. Their history was a scroll of endless bloodshed, tribal wars, religious crusades, industrialized genocide, global destruction followed by rapid rebuilding. And yet, despite the self-inflicted chaos, they survived. Not just survived, thrived. Where other species would have gone extinct, humans adapted. Where most would submit, they evolved. Pain, it seemed, was a teacher they revered rather than feared. Their homeworld was unlike any we'd cataloged, a death world in every measurable way. It hosted extreme weather events, atmospheric instability, apex predators with chemical and physical lethality, and pathogens that defied our medical understanding. Our most hardened reconnaissance drones were damaged within hours of atmospheric entry. Several simply vanished. But the humans lived there. They built civilizations there. They fought each other for territory, for resources, for pride, and somehow, always, clawed their way forward. Our initial contact protocols were cautious. We observed, studied, and debated. Our xenoanthropologists suggested containment. Our technocrats warned of unpredictable technological leaps. Our diplomats recommended integration before corruption could take root. But our military, they scoffed. What threat could a fractured species, barely capable of orbit, possibly pose to a galaxy-spanning alliance? And so, the vote was cast. Peaceful containment protocols. It was called a mercy mission, a stabilization campaign. We told ourselves we would uplift them, civilize them, that we'd offer guidance, medicine, order, that we were saving them from themselves. But in truth, we feared them. Our fleets entered their orbit cloaked in diplomatic rhetoric. We severed their communications, disabled their satellites, and disrupted their energy grids, non-lethal, efficient, and absolute. We believed that once they saw our power, they would submit, that they'd fall in line as others had before them. But humans didn't kneel, they didn't plead, they didn't hesitate. They fought, with weapons a fraction as advanced as ours. They retaliated in days, not weeks. Days. Their militaries, once divided by borders and ideologies, unified with terrifying speed. Entire nations dissolved their rivalries overnight. Warring factions pooled their resources. Ancient enemies stood side by side. Not because they loved each other, but because something worse had arrived. We underestimated how deeply they understood war, how intimately they knew sacrifice, strategy, and suffering. They struck our forward bases with precision strikes, hijacked our drones, captured and reverse-engineered our tech. One human general detonated a nuclear device under his own base just to prevent capture. Another led an orbital boarding assault, using retrofitted space shuttles launched manually. They weren't just defending themselves. They were studying us, adapting, and evolving. We quickly realized we weren't dealing with a civilization on the cusp of development. We were dealing with apex survivors, creatures honed by a world that had tried to kill them from the moment they could walk. Their biology alone baffled us. Their pain threshold was absurd. Their stamina defied logic. They could operate with broken limbs, massive blood loss, even critical organ failure. And they weren't born for a single environment. They thrived across deserts, oceans, Arctic tundras, and poison jungles. Many of our species required controlled habitats just to function. The humans, they breathed ash and charged into fire. It wasn't just physical. Psychologically, they were worse, unpredictable, unyielding. Their minds, while chaotic, were resistant to fear conditioning. They mourned their dead but used that grief like fuel. Their anger didn't cloud judgment, it clarified it. They were emotionally unstable, yes, but somehow that instability gave them strength we didn't understand. They disobeyed the rules of war, not because they were barbaric, but because they wrote their own rules and rewrote them as needed. They hacked our language networks, broadcast false retreats, feigned diplomacy only to ambush us with explosives buried in their own embassies. What kind of species buries explosives under its own embassy? Humans. Every time we thought we had them surrounded, they reappeared behind us. Every time we crushed a resistance cell, another rose with twice the fury. Cities we occupied fell within days. They used our tech against us, turned our drones into bombs, our medical supplies into poisons, our translators into propaganda machines. This wasn't occupation. This was war. A kind of war we hadn't seen in centuries, and we were losing. We'd arrived expecting savages. What we found were strategists, survivors, monsters bred by a planet that wanted them dead, and failed. That was our first mistake. We thought we were bringing peace. We thought we were the masters of this galaxy. We thought they'd be grateful. But Terra doesn't breed gratitude, it breeds Deathworlders. And they were just getting started. We believed their resistance would be brief. We had crushed rebellions before pacified planets with populations 10 times their size. Even the more aggressive species in coalition history had learned quickly that resistance was futile. Our fleets were faster, our weapons smarter, and our soldiers enhanced through centuries of bioengineering. But humans weren't fighting with advanced tech, but they were fighting with fury. We had jammed their communications, but they used hand signals and light pulses. We destroyed their satellites, and they used weather balloons and scavenged electronics to make new ones. We occupied their cities, and they turned their sewer systems into infiltration tunnels. Striking from beneath our feet, first contact turned into first blood. A diplomatic shuttle sent to land near one of their military bases was obliterated by a shoulder-fired missile built decades before our arrival. Our scouts were ambushed in jungles and deserts, dragged into the darkness by creatures that bled, screamed, and kept moving even after limbs were severed. A recon drone hovering over one of their urban zones was hacked midair and crashed into our command post, carrying explosives made from their own fertilizer. It wasn't just resistance, it was revenge. Our commanders called for escalation, orbital strikes, targeted demolitions, non-lethal crowd suppression until those crowds began wearing body armor made from our own wreckage. And they never stopped adapting. One of our elite strike units landed outside a place they called Detroit. Within an hour, they were surrounded not by soldiers, but by mechanics, engineers, and armed civilians in scavenged uniforms. They used magnetized scrap to disable our exosuits, poured liquid nitrogen onto our plasma cannons to fracture the coils, turned household appliances into signal jammers. They weren't just resisting with weapons, they were resisting with ingenuity. We sent in stealth infiltrators to observe and report. None returned. One managed to transmit a partial recording, barely 2 minutes long. The footage showed a single human, crouched behind broken concrete, staring directly into the camera. He smiled. Then the feed cut to black. We never found the infiltrator's body. More troubling, the humans began to anticipate us. They'd appear exactly where our dropships were scheduled to land. Sometimes hours before, they developed countermeasures, 2 weapons we'd only deployed once, They mimicked our command structure, created false signals, fed us disinformation. We ran full-spectrum psychological analysis on captured soldiers. The results were so disturbing our AI refused to parse some of the emotional data. One report labeled their mental profiles as nonlinear with recursive aggression patterns. Another simply read, unquantifiable rage. Do not engage directly. We tried negotiation. We transmitted surrender offers, ceasefires, humanitarian aid, prisoner exchanges. They didn't respond with words. They responded with fire. A mobile med transport, clearly marked with non-combat symbols, was lured into a field hospital and detonated using pressure charges, triggered by heartbeat sensors keyed to detect our own species. The human planners had studied our biology in detail. They built traps tailored to us. They weaponized empathy, used our laws of engagement as tools of war. It wasn't mindless violence. It was precision, cold, calculated, unforgiving. Our battlefield, I, trained on centuries of pacified conflicts, broke down mid-campaign. One unit attempted to initiate a retreat protocol across the entire southern hemisphere. Another, tasked with urban navigation, simply looped the same message for 2 hours. Unknown variables exceed tolerances. Reboot suggested. We tried subjugation. We tried overwhelming force. We tried reason. They answered with fury, fire, and ferocity, and always with strategy. Human soldiers would drag injured comrades miles under fire just to regroup and launch counter-assaults. They'd charge into energy cannons with only ballistic armor. They'd plant explosives beneath their own supply depots, baiting us into raiding them before blowing them sky-high. In one infamous engagement, our forces cornered a battalion near what they called the Himalayas. Outnumbered, surrounded, and freezing, the humans held their position for 3 days. They used the terrain like a weapon, causing avalanches, collapsing cliffs, setting traps with frozen bodies. When we finally took the mountain, there were no survivors, only a message, carved into the rock by hand. If you came in peace, you would have left in peace. You didn't. That message spread like wildfire across coalition channels. Not officially, of course. The council tried to suppress it, but our soldiers began repeating the words, first in fear, then in reverence. What kind of species does this? What kind of creature fights not for conquest or pride but because the alternative is submission? We began to understand. Humans don't fight to win. They fight because they refuse to lose. Even in death, they made it costly. Our casualty reports were no longer numbers, they were stories, names, warnings. We started assigning psychological counselors to every returning unit. Some soldiers refused to leave orbit again. Some defected. A few began studying human tactics, admiring them. That was when we realized we hadn't just lost control of the war. We had lost the illusion of superiority, the idea that we were more advanced, more evolved, more civilized. It shattered. Because for all our wisdom, all our technology, all our peaceful ideals, we had never been tested. Humans had lived their entire history in the test. Their very existence was forged in fire, fear, and struggle. And now that fire had reached the stars, we tried to extinguish it. Instead, we fed it. And that fire was learning. It was growing. It was coming for us. What began as a single planetary engagement on Terra spiraled outward like a contagion, one carried not by humans alone, but by the ideas they inspired. The first signs were whispers, minor skirmishes, small mutinies, localized insurgencies. Then came the uprisings on coalition outposts near the Seoul Corridor. Civilian workers refused orders. Some sabotaged their own calm rays. Others opened docking bays and let human prisoners escape. The humans didn't just fight us on their planet. They made the war follow them. Coalition strategy had always relied on clean battle lines, on territory that could be mapped and controlled. We had protocols for civil unrest, subversive tech, and even religious rebellion. But we had no defense against what humans brought, chaos. They didn't deploy in organized fleets or predictable patterns. They arrived in pieces, refitted mining vessels, colony shuttles, or scavenged scrap that looked like junk until it exploded under our hangar bays. They didn't conquer planets, they infiltrated them, started fires we couldn't put out. It began with outposts, minor stations near disputed zones. Then it spread to trade hubs, research facilities, terraforming colonies. By the time we realized the scale of the infection, over a dozen worlds had reported sightings of unregistered human units operating in shadows, destabilizing infrastructures, vanishing before we could act. And when we found them, they never went quietly. Entire units would dig in, outgunned and outnumbered, and fight until the last breath. When cornered, they'd detonate themselves to take out command centers. They fought not just with weapons, but with timing, striking. During our rest cycles, during shifts, during public celebrations, they turned our efficiency into a weakness, our order into a liability. They hacked our systems with primitive code. They bypassed our AI firewalls with logic loops made of sarcasm and slang. They transmitted taunts in our native dialects, mocking our failure to understand them. One message simply read, "You brought ships, we brought survival." At first, we assumed their presence on other worlds was limited to survivors or escapees. We were wrong. They were recruiting. Humanity's stories spread like wildfire across the underbelly of the galaxy, tales of fierce warriors defying the mighty coalition, of a Deathworld species pushing back the tide, disenfranchised species, outcasts. Even exiled criminals began joining them, not always for belief but for the thrill, the chaos, the vengeance. They called themselves the Ember Line, a name whispered with both awe and terror. They weren't a military, they were a virus. And we couldn't predict them. We deployed entire fleets to cordon off affected systems, patrol squadrons, blockade lines, ground units trained in psychological warfare. It didn't matter. Wherever we tightened control, the humans slipped through cracks. Wherever we raised defenses, they were already inside. On the jungle moon of Kairos 4, they poisoned our water supply with genetically altered algae. On the mining world of Zelterran, they rerouted our own cargo lifters into orbital bombardment weapons. On the glacial plains of Juxpalar, they fought in temperatures that froze our systems solid and marched for days without shelter or heat. They moved through pain like it was familiar terrain. One of our captains described it best in his final report before self-termination. They don't win by overpowering us. They win by making us choose between caution and action, survival and morality. And every time we hesitate, they move. We started deploying counter-infiltration units specifically trained to track human guerrillas. It worked briefly until humans began baiting those teams into traps. They'd capture our elite trackers, extract their access codes, and broadcast falsified orders to entire fleets. In one instance, they redirected a supply convoy straight into a black hole just to see if we'd notice. The Ember Line was laughing at us. But their tactics weren't just effective, they were infectious. Some of our own soldiers began to mimic them. Discipline eroded. Paranoia spread. Units began second-guessing orders, assuming any directive could be a hack. Some refused to engage human units unless backup arrived. Some defected entirely, adopting human tactics and symbols. Entire species within the coalition began questioning the war. Why were we still fighting? Why did this Deathworld species, supposedly barbaric and violent, evoke loyalty and resistance in people who had never even seen Terra? Our leadership ignored the questions. They doubled down, increased firepower, authorized unrestricted orbital cleansing on human infected zones. We called it containment. The humans called it fuel. For every world we scorched, another rose in rebellion. For every ship we silenced, 5 more emerged from forgotten asteroid belts. They did not fear death, they used it. On the volcanic moon of Denarix, one human operative strapped himself to a decaying fusion core and walked into our forward base. He smiled the entire time. When questioned why, he answered with a single phrase before the explosion: "Because this time, you'll remember us." And we did. Not because of their weapons, not because of their strength, but because they would not stop. They did not sleep when we slept. They did not retreat when we expected them to. They defied logic, defied probability, defied rules. 10 to 1, they still fought. Outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered, they adapted. Where one fell, two rose. Where we thought victory was certain, they rewrote the outcome. This was not a war in the way we understood war. It was something older, something primal, a species born of fire and blood, cast into the stars with a single, terrifying instinct: survive, at any cost. And now, we were the ones counting the cost, not in ships, not in territory, but in the slow, creeping realization that we had awakened something that would never go back to sleep. The humans were no longer just defending Earth. They were redefining what it meant to fight, and they were just getting started. It happened on Ventari Prime. The stronghold was a jewel in coalition defense, a fortress world carved into a mountain range, surrounded by anti-orbital cannons, shielded bunkers, and subterranean command tunnels. It had never fallen, not during the resource conflicts, not during the Virix insurgency. It was thought impregnable, untouchable. We stationed for fleets in orbit, 30,000 ground troops. I controlled defense grids, atmospheric denial systems. No one could breach it. And yet, the humans did. They didn't come with a fleet. They didn't launch a traditional assault. They slipped in, somehow, through the fog of war and our failing sensors. They were already inside before we even sounded the alarm. At first, it was dismissed: static anomalies, missing patrols, routine system glitches. Then the gravity wells collapsed. Ventari's moons began to shudder out of alignment. Artificial satellites spiraled out of control. Communications with our outer defensive ring were cut, not jammed, ripped away, like they'd never existed. One of our commanders looked at the data stream and simply whispered, "They're playing with the laws of physics." The humans had found a way to destabilize localized gravity fields. Using scavenged gravtech, they weaponized planetary mass itself, turning the orbital environment into a minefield of crushing forces. Our ships were torn apart before they could even lock targets. Soldiers were flattened in their bunkers instantaneously, compressed under artificial singularities. It was not a battle. It was slaughter. We tried to evacuate command. Too late. The tunnels were already compromised. Our sensor nets failed to register life signs until it was too late. A recovery team found one of the bunkers littered with corpses, our own and a human. But the humans were rigged dead bodies laced with chemical traps and explosive triggers. Their own fallen, turned into weapons. They knew we would come to collect. They knew we'd try to understand. And they turned that instinct against us. The humans didn't storm Ventari Prime. They consumed it. Every chamber, every corridor, every checkpoint they moved through like a plague, overwhelming our defenses not through numbers, but will. They sacrificed entire squads to breach a single door. They fought with sharpened scrap, with plasma coils ripped from our own walls. In one instance, they used their own blood to write targeting coordinates on a fallen drone, then reactivated it to fire on our escaped transports. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to destroy us. That's when I realized it. This wasn't survival. This wasn't defense. This was vengeance. We had called it liberation. They remembered it as invasion. We had offered guidance. They remembered orbiting gunships and cities turned to glass. And now, they wanted us to feel what they felt. Ventari Prime fell in less than 48 hours. No human fleet. No coordinated army. Just waves of fury wrapped in flesh and bone. When the final transmission came through, it wasn't coordinates or tactics, it was a human voice. Ragged, calm, measured. "You'll forget our names," the voice said, "but you will never forget what we did to you." We didn't just lose a stronghold. We lost the illusion of containment, of control, of superiority. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day, and it failed. So they learned to kill in return. Now the galaxy knows what Terra raised. Not diplomats, not colonists, but predators. This was their warning. Next time, it won't be one. Thanks for watching.